show you how to make your Zoom meeting as secure as possible for you and your students. We've all seen the news recently where districts have had people outside of their network hack into virtual meetings. We don't want this to happen, and we want to make sure that we are taking every step possible to keep our students and our staff safe. So today I'm going to show you 3 simple steps to make sure that you are protecting you and your students. The first one is checking your settings. The second one is when you create the meeting itself. And the third one is once you start the meeting. So let's start with step 1. We're going to sign into Zoom's website. You're going to sign in using your Norman Public Schools account and Google. Once you've gone through the sign-in, it'll take you to this page. On the left-hand side under Personal, go to Settings. You want to make sure you're on the Meetings tab. Under this tab, we are going to do 5 different things. The first one is we're going to check the participants video. This one is crucial. Right here, it's second from the top, we want to make sure that students' videos are turned off when they join our meeting. The reason for this is because several students may live in conditions they don't want their fellow classmates to see, or they just don't feel comfortable on camera. So we want to give them the option to turn it on if they feel comfortable, but we want to start with it off. So make sure you have it toggled off. It should be gray. The second is we want to make sure that we have passwords set up. Luckily, our district admin have already set this up, but you want to double check it. So see it says locked by admin. Require a password. Every time you set up a meeting, you also want to make sure this is constantly toggled on. So we have that. The third is we want to disable private chat. So down here where it says in meetings basic, you have a few different features. So you have the chat. You can turn off chat altogether. But sometimes you want to leave that on in case students have questions for you. So let's leave that on. And then the second one is private chat. This is where you cannot see, if you're the host, you can't see messages happening between students. So we want to make sure this is toggled off. It's going to be gray once you have it set properly. The next one is a few steps down. So we've turned off private chat. Now we want to turn off file transfer, and mine's already off. But what this does is this makes sure that no participants can send files or anything to each other while you are in your virtual lesson. So make sure it's gray. Keep going down and you'll see screen sharing. Screen sharing is where students or the host or the teacher can share their desktop screen with one another. You want to make sure that you can share your screen, but your students can't. So the first step to this is make sure screen sharing is on. It's blue. So make sure it's blue. Who can share? Make sure it's host only. And then save. That way, if for some reason somebody does hack into your Zoom account, which we hope does not happen, they are not able to share their screen. So just make sure host is on. These settings should stay consistent throughout all your meetings, but it's good to double check them from time to time. So now that I have done all my settings, there might be some more that you want to go through, so feel free to look around. But once you have that, the next step is for us to actually create a meeting. So you're going to go to Zoom's website. You're going to go to the Meetings tab on the left-hand side. Once you're on this tab, click Schedule a New Meeting. There are a few different ways to schedule a new meeting. You can do it through this option, or you can do it through your Norman Public Schools Google Calendar. This is the first one I'll show you. So it's going to ask you to type in a few different things. So I'm going to name my meeting. Okay. Also, while I'm creating a meeting, I'm going to go ahead and say this. When you're doing meetings with your students, you want to make sure you don't have too many students on your meetings. As we know, we are not in a typical classroom setting. That means our classroom management definitely looks different. The more students you have on a meeting, the more unpredictable it becomes. So you want to make sure that you have fewer students on a meeting than you probably would have in a classroom. So you're going to name it, and there are a few different things we're going to make sure that we're checking. You want to make sure you have the time and the date, the duration. You want to make sure this is not a reoccurring meeting. The next thing you want to do is check your meeting ID. You want to make sure that you have a unique ID for all your meetings. To do this, you want to make sure that it is toggled on Generate automatically. This is different than using a personal meeting ID. A personal meeting ID is for reoccurring meetings. This means anybody with that personal meeting ID can log on to that meeting. We do not want this. So make sure you create a unique ID every time you have a meeting. So click that. The next one is you want to make sure your meeting has a password. Like I said before, our district has this locked in place, but you always want to double check this. So as you see, it is grayed out and I can't toggle this off. That's important. Next, you will see that there is a generated password already made, and each time you do a meeting, it should change. So just make sure it's changing between your meetings. Next, you want to double check that your settings are correct for your video. So when people get onto our classroom, my video is going to be automatically on and participants are going to be automatically off. They can turn it on as they go through the meeting, but they want to start with it off. Make sure audio is set. And then here are some other options you get to have. Make sure that if this is a meeting between you and your students, you have this toggled off. Enable join before host. We do not want students to be in a virtual classroom without a teacher. It's just like a regular classroom without a teacher. We want to make sure that they are supervised at all times. So make sure that's off. I always make sure that my participants are muted upon entry. That way, it's quiet and they can hear my instructions before we get started. The next one is you want to enable waiting room. This is the newest feature on Zoom that has really helped with the hackings that have been happening. This waiting room feature allows you as a teacher control over who comes into your classroom and who you remove from your classroom. So make sure you have that toggled on. Once you have gone through your creating a meeting, hit save, and your meeting is now created. The last step with creating a meeting is you want to make sure that when you're inviting students to your classroom that this is by invite only. That means that you are either adding it to a Google Calendar, you are emailing it to their student email addresses, or last, you are posting it on Google Classroom. You want to make sure that you are not posting this in a public setting. That means social media, anything where somebody outside of our network can see. So you'll have your meeting ID. You can either click Google Classroom, or you can copy this invitation and post it onto your Google Classroom for your students to join. And then whenever you're ready to start the meeting, click Start the Meeting. I would be very careful about sending that link ahead of time. I would do it maybe about 30 minutes before your meeting. That way, it's just more secure and there are less hiccups. So once you have started your meeting, you notice I'm the only one in. We're going to have students join. So as my student tries to join, we're going to notice that they are in the waiting room. I can either admit them or I can see the waiting room. First thing you want to do is you want to make sure that your student has their first and last name before they join the meeting. Obviously, you know who your students are, and you know what their names are. So I'm in the waiting room. If my student does not have that, I can message them. And right here, everyone in the waiting room, or I can pick a certain, I can message people in the meeting too. And I might say, please make sure your first and your last name are on your Zoom meeting. I can also decide to remove them. So if I don't recognize them, I will remove them. Or if my student is not showing their first and last name, I might message them, let them sit there for a second, and if they do not change it, I will remove them, because one of my rules for my virtual classroom is their first and last name has to be shown. So there's that. So I'm going to admit this person. The next thing you want to do is you want to make sure once you have all your participants in your classroom, you are locked in. So over here on the right hand side, where my waiting room is, there is mute all, unmute all, and more. I click more, and it'll have a few different options. So I can mute participants on entry, which we set up in our settings, and allow participants to unmute themselves. So if you're trying to teach a concept, this one's really helpful to turn that off. And then there's a few others. You want to make sure that participants are not allowed to rename themselves. We all know kids who like to rename themselves. We want to make sure that they don't have that option. See, you just click it and it turns on, click it and it turns off. The last thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you have locked your meeting. So no more participants should be able to be in. No new attendees. It'll give you this message. Go ahead and click OK. So, of course, I only have one person in my waiting room. But if you notice, I have the option, say this student is not behaving appropriately. I have a few different options I can do. I can put them back in the waiting room and privately message them and tell them to get their act together, or I can remove them. And this is helpful if somebody does hack your meeting. So you can hit remove. And they'll be removed. The final thing you want to do is if for some reason an unknown person does get through all of these security settings and something happens on Zoom, you can end the meeting and it removes everybody all at once. So there is a difference between leaving the meeting and ending the meeting. So as a teacher, you're going to go to the right-hand corner where it's red and it says end meeting, and a dialog box will pop up. It'll say, do I want to leave the meeting, which will leave my participants in there, or do I want to end the meeting for all? Again, just like in our classrooms, we don't want students unattended. So why would we want them unattended in a virtual setting as well? So we want to make sure that we hit the right one and click end meeting for all, and that'll end the meeting for all my students and I.
Well, that wraps up another great episode of Innovate Your Classroom. Stay tuned for more with Chris,
Sarah, Christiona, Paige, Stacy,
and Rob.